Scott Dochterman. Chad Leistikow. Together on one pod, talking Hawks and all things Big Ten. Powered by GameDay Men's Health, with locations in Ankeny, West Des Moines, and North Liberty. From the Channel Seed Studios, this is Legends and Listeners. Exclusively on Iowa Everywhere.
Such a powerful intro. I love it. Hey, Hawkeye fans, Big Ten fans, and Iowans everywhere. Welcome to episode 52 of Legends and Listeners. Means we've almost made it a full year. Here on the Iowa Everywhere Network, I am Chad Leistikow of the Des Moines Register, joined, as always, by the Athletics' Scott Dochterman. We are coming to you from the Channel Seed Studios on this Wednesday morning, the day that Iowa football opens. Fall camp practice. What a big day, Scott. The focus of today's show will be indeed the big news that hit over the weekend with incredible changes to the college sports model in terms of revenue sharing, scholarship increases, roster limits, and a historic enforcement system, which we'll discuss. But first, let's take at least a minute or two to discuss the beginning of fall camp for the Hawkeyes, Scott. How much is at stake over the next 31 days?
Well, I really think that this team is capable of competing for a playoff spot. So it has to improve. It has to improve on offense. It has to find depth along the defensive line. It has to, you want to have some consistency at punter and at kicker, I think. And if that all happens, then I think this team is more than capable of being in that conversation. And I think that's what you want. I mean, anything's possible, as we know. It could be a field goal here, a field goal there in about 3 to 4 games. But I think that, making sure the offense installation goes smoothly and you build a relationship on the field between quarterback and receivers and offensive line and running backs, I think that's really what you want to do. And it's one step at a time. And you can't skip a step. And not to be a coach speak here, but that's true. And I'm sure we'll see some of it a week from Saturday, Chad. And, I'm sure there's going to be 15 guys or so who will be out and we won't see it all.
Yeah, exactly. Our plan for Legends and Listeners is to give you kind of a media day, kids day preview next week. But we're also going to revisit my one-on-one with Tim Lester, which podcast should be available sometime today with Hawk Central. And I had a really good conversation with him, Scott, on Monday. And just to kind of follow up on what you were saying, two things struck me. And I think fans will catch this as they listen to the podcast. Number one, it's definitely his offense. Everyone who's saying, like, this is Ferentz's offense. Like, this is a completely different system that's coming into Iowa football. One that's not really in college football. It's mostly an NFL system, as we know. And so it's really fascinating to see if he can pull it off, Tim Lester. But it also struck me that, like, he is still just getting to know his personnel. Like, he's never coached a practice with Cade McNamara at quarterback. And there's a month till the season here. He's never coached a practice with Brendan Sullivan at quarterback. He's never coached really hardly any of these wide receivers other than, the little bit of passing they got with Deacon Hill in the spring, which is kind of irrelevant at this point. So it's kind of a word of caution that this install is not an overnight thing. But I do feel like, just in general, especially after talking to him, I got to spend about 90 minutes in his office. About 50 of that will be on the pod. Like, he knows what he's doing. And so it's an exciting time for Hawkeye football. And for me, this whole month is about the offense. And I don't know how much we're going to know. I don't know how good this offense is going to be, Scott. But I like what I'm hearing about the process of the offense. And hopefully fans can kind of gather that as well.
Well, I'm insanely jealous. I guess I get last year with the offensive coordinator.
That's right.
You get this year with you get this year. So, Andy Garman, I'm coming for you, buddy. You're only helping out Chad this year. So, no, just kidding.
It was
I think. What's that?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm interested in reading and listening to what was said and how this comes together, because this is going to be the. You talk about, there's some really pivotal offensive coordinator hires in the Big Ten, and this is one of them. You look at a lot of the, I don't say mid-level teams, but there are a lot of teams that have had, I mean, just about all of them, in fact, have had some sort of major hire. I mean, Chip Kelly going to OC at Ohio State, Sharon Moore getting bumped up to head coach officially at Michigan. Andy Kotelnicki went from Kansas's OC to Penn State's OC. Iowa has a new OC in Tim Lester, as you said. Defensive assistant at USC. So everybody's going to have some changes here. And but I think at Iowa to go from the 1999 offense to 2024 is really important. And if Kirk can, I've said this for years, Kirk can just kind of oversee it, answer the big questions. It's 4th and 1 at the opponent's 40. Do you punt or do you go for it? Answer those questions. But and generally speaking, run or pass. But for the most part, let Tim Lester run it. I mean, I think he's somebody who has done it, and I'm glad to hear that it is his offense and Kirk is just going to be kind of coaching individual players and overseeing the whole production that is Iowa football.
Yeah, I just think it's an exciting, time to observe the program, and I'm excited to what we'll see next weekend at Kids Day, and certainly throughout the season. It's going to be a work in progress, but I think there's going to be some changes. At least we can, break down. We can watch a bunch of. It was funny. Well, I don't want to get too deep into it, but
yeah.
it was because you're an NFL guy, and so it was just a lot of fun to talk about NFL offenses, and what he's observed there and why it works and all this stuff. And so it's pretty fascinating. I mean, everybody. I think he said 20 of the 32 teams now run some version of the Shanahan offense. So, including at the Packers, which he was last year. Unfortunately, he was super complimentary of the Packers, Scott. So it was hard to listen to. Yeah, that's how wonderful the Packers were. And he's a bit.
Well, at least
he grew up a Bears fan. So,
well, you're always a fan of the place that signs your checks. So that would include Green Bay, I'm sure, for him, but I think also for the one thing with the Shanahan system that's always been fascinating to me is it takes a smart person to run it because the verbiage is so damn long. I mean, it's like German, where they put 15 words together. It's kind of like that with Shanahan. It'll take like 10 seconds just to read the play off, and so hopefully Cade can grasp all that and turn it around and have some decent plays coming in. But the Shanahan system is really what Iowa can do, and I'm excited to see it. It's better than most systems, for him, including one by Paul Crisp that I championed. But I think this fits more in like with what Kirk wants to do running the football because it has more zone concepts.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I don't want to spoil anymore. We're going to talk more about it on next week's show. So let's move on. Friday, the NCAA and Power Conferences filed an agreement. It was a long one as a result of the House versus NCAA settlement that outlines more specifics about the college model effective in the 2025-26 academic year. You wrote a piece in The Athletic. You co-authored a piece that went online Tuesday, Scott. And I liked how you did it. You kind of went sport by sport. I think that's a good way to maybe get into this conversation if you're cool with that, just because I think that will help us lead into the tangents of, topics like sports cutting, sports tiering, maybe how NIL collectives are involved in all this. And obviously it starts with football, right? One of the big changes here, Scott, is going from 85 scholarships to 105, but also a roster cap of 105. I noticed I think the lead quote in your article was from Ferentz. Iowa, very much known as a program that thrives on walk-ons. I'm coming to grips, I guess, with how this is better or worse for that that system, because you get more players. There's going to be presumably in theory, like the guys you essentially let, go from walk-on to scholarship just become scholarship if you think about it in one way. But in the other way, it's like, well, like the Quinn Schultes of the world, maybe they don't even get a scholarship offer except from, South Dakota State, which is what he had. So what do you think about the 105 roster cap, which is far less than the 130-ish that Iowa currently has on its team?
Yeah, you look at Iowa, Nebraska is right around 150. There are a lot of players who are going to be out of uniform next year and going to different places. It's going to be seismic in this sport. And for developmental programs in particular, it does kind of hurt. In Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Nebraska, Iowa State, because they rely so heavily on walk-ons. And I equate it to, in NFL terms, that if Ohio State and Michigan, they're picking first and second round kind of guys, 5 and 4 stars all the time, and Iowa's getting largely 3 stars. When you're looking at a lot of these small town guys in Iowa, who gets a scholarship and who gets a walk-on, there's not a whole lot of difference. Sometimes it's height, it's 2 inches of height, or it's 10 pounds, or it's, but once they get to Iowa, then then it doesn't matter, and then we've seen that they fill gaps. They have 3 or 4 guys every year who play important roles that are in this case. But the more I'm studying this, talking about it and writing about it, I'm seeing some of the positives that can happen out of this, and some of the things that maybe we freak out about that we don't have to freak out about. And that is, they can still, instead of going straight up 20 scholarships, they could still stay at 85 and use different means for the other 20, which would be NIL payments or something to that effect. Or they could go up to 10. Now you're allowed to have, partial scholarships for players. You never could before with football. So you might say, we're still going to recruit in the 80s for our legitimate, our core team, but maybe we're going to have the other 15 to 20-ish consist of walk-on caliber players, a Quinn Schulte, a Jalen Thompson, all these different players that, before you would kind of recruit as walk-ons, and then, then at the end, you would decide whether or not they would get a scholarship, a partial scholarship, or something to that effect. So maybe you're only using 95 scholarships, but you're dividing the final 10 over 20 players. So there are ways that this can work. The questions I have is, how is this going to work in, like, let's say a kid gets an ACL in spring practice. Does he have to be part of that, 105? When it comes to walk-ons, can you have tryouts? Could you have like 30 players come in for 10, 15 spots? Stuff like that, I think those are legitimate questions. They'll be answered soon, I'm sure. Probably not, but anyway, though, that's kind of at the outset of how this scholarship stuff works for the football teams.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that was one thing that I learned too in the last couple of days. That they can split up these football scholarships now. Never could before at the FBS level. And it also made me think about, well, if you're in Iowa, first of all, does Iowa fund 105 scholarships, for example? Because if you do, then you got to offset that with 20 fewer men's scholarships in other sports. We'll get to some other sports as we go, but they're not easy to find men's scholarships. You're going to have to either add women's sports, which is, you're already talking about increasing your budget by a lot with $22 million in revenue sharing, potentially. What does Iowa decide to do? Do they go, like you said, maybe they go 95 and do what would that be? Like fully fund 85 and then have 10 half scholarships, for 20 walk-on style players. Maybe it's a punter, maybe it's a kicker. Maybe it's the Johnny Pascuzzi type, somebody like that you normally would bring in, maybe is like, guy number 106, 102 or something. But I also think, Scott, if you're in Iowa, you probably want to leave some spots open because, just like the Caden Proctor thing,
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, we'll work on the scholarships later. But if you don't have like a roster spot, you can't bring someone up there. So if it, does a program like Iowa, intentionally leave open 5 roster spots and, maybe some of those are walk-ons or whatever. But I don't know. It's like that stuff is interesting to me for sure. What do you make of, I don't know, how much other schools are going to be able to fund this? Because you gotta have a balance between men's and women's scholarships. That part won't change with Title IX. Like we'll see how revenue sharing changes. If that means, let's say 11 million men and women, or if it's going to be, 17 million, 5 million. I don't know. I don't have a feel for that yet. It seems like they're waiting on that right now.
That part is to me, it's going to end up in a lawsuit one way or the other, and probably in front of the Supreme Court at some point when you deal with the revenue split. Is it going to be based on marketability, or is it going to be based on Title IX? It does providing equal opportunity end with the scholarship and the ability to have a quality athletic experience, or does it end, or should that also include financial? Because then if you start to look at that and say, well, why is the football coach making $7 million a year and the women's tennis coach making whatever, $100,000 a year or something like that? That's not, according to Title IX, if you start to use that kind of rationale, that's where it gets tricky. But I think when we're looking at the scholarships, I don't know that. I used to be concerned that football was just going to bury everything, and then they're going to have to figure out how to spread 20 scholarships over to the women's side. And I do think that is going to be something that everybody's going to have to discuss at every single campus. But I think for schools like Iowa, that they're all going to be in a similar vein, which is they're going to have some splits and split scholarships. They're not going to fully go to 105. A few might, but I think at least at first they're going to dip their toe in the water and see how this works. Because can a place like Iowa find 105 legitimate Division I 3-star on up players? Probably not, because the ones that aren't coming here are going to UNI or something like that in a lot of cases. Now in Ohio State and Alabama, they might find that's what they want to do. But that creates their own problems because, and we talked to some G5 that Chris Vanini did, who helped out with that. He talked to some G5 coaches like Trent Dilfer at UAB and Ryan Silverfield at Memphis. And, their thought is that we fight for the players we fight are like 78 through 85 on an SEC roster. Those are the ones we try to get. Well, now, they're going to get $35,000 and go to Georgia and play for their dream school rather than go to UAB. But, so they're going to be the 104th player on that roster. And the walk-ons that normally go to those SEC schools or even Big Ten schools aren't necessarily going to be good enough to go to G5s. And maybe they are for a UNI, but not for a MAC school. So I think that it's going to be toes in the water. I don't think Iowa's just going to say, we're going to fund 20 more scholarships and do it hardcore, because you're just not going to be able to find 105 players. And then at the big schools, keeping them all happy is going to be really tough. If you've got 105 4-star athletes at Ohio State, by the end of training camp, a third of them are going to be really pissed. So I think Iowa is probably going to philosophically do what it normally does. And I think that's what it's going to be, that 15 to 20 walk-on types, preferred walk-ons, the ones they invite, the ones they list every year. And then there'll probably be cuts at some point too. I think that'll be part of this as well.
Do you recall what the travel roster size is, Scott? Is it like 73 still? Did they up it?
I think it's 75.
75. Okay. So I just wonder, like, at these Ohio States, Alabamas, if you're going to be one of these 105 and you're not if you're in the bottom 30, like, I don't know. Like, I think transfers will increase even more. I mean, I think those, because you're not going to want to go to a school and not even travel, not even dress for the games. I mean, that's one thing to like not play, but like not to even go on the trips. I mean, ask Cooper DeJean how that felt to not be at the Iowa State game in 2021. Like it's hard to make it's not a given. So I don't know. As you talk it through, I could see this, Scott. Maybe Iowa goes to 90 football scholarships, just as an example. Maybe you go 80 full scholarships, go 10 half scholarships, something. I mean, maybe it's not exactly like that. And then 5 walk-on spots or 5 quote-unquote open spots where you kind of have some roster flexibility. Maybe they are true walk-ons, and they can earn their way to a half scholarship or whatever. I mean, I think Ferentz and Fry both did a great job of selling that. Ferentz, as we know, loves taking guys that are trying to go up a level, from, let's say, an Iowa Western. Let's say, pick an FCS transfer. Seth Anderson, great example. He likes those types of guys that are trying to prove themselves at the next level, because it's good to have incentive. And so, yeah, I mean, I definitely could see, the more we talk about it, the less I see Iowa maybe going to that 105, trying to fully fund the 105, even though Beth Getz last week said we want to, we're going to fund this at a championship level. I don't know if that, like you said, I don't know if it needs to be 105. And I think I think transfers too. Remember that quote that Big Ten Media Days about that Ferentz said to somebody? He's like, yeah, I've always said, like, if we could get the MAC All-Stars, we'd have a pretty good roster.
Yeah.
Why not, kind of almost facilitate that with a little bit of opening? Like, hey, we'll take the best of, we'll let the Quinn Schultes of the world, for example, go to Northern Illinois for 2 years, and then we'll take them, that type of thing.
No question. And that's a way to funnel the things if you want to do it that way. I mean, that's kind of that's kind of what everybody's trying to avoid, is turning into a minor league system, if you will, of some of these players. But then other ones, as we've seen, take a Gavin Williams, for instance, wasn't going to be able to play enough here. And then you go down to a different level and you play well and you enjoy it. And we've seen that a lot over the years too. So, I mean, there's always been give and take. And now with immediate eligibility, I think that's really important. But I guess overall, Chad, I don't see a lot of downsides for Iowa. Sure, I think it's sad that 20 players aren't going to have the opportunity to wear the black and gold the way they want to. But I think they're still going to have, 20 players that will have the opportunity and receive some sort of stipend or compensation or partial scholarships. And the way to do it that's really smart is, I mean, they love to go to the Chicagoland area. And now if you recruit, Ryan Fitzgerald, the quarterback, Pat Fitzgerald's son, he comes over here as a walk-on. He doesn't have to fit the whole bill now. Maybe as a partial scholarship, you say, we'll pay your tuition and you pay for the rest. And then there's NIL, there's those types of payments interior that will help provide the supplement. And then you do the flip, like the books and the rent or whatever, you do that for the Iowa kid, or you split it 75-25, and then have some players that are, bona fide walk-on types that are going to take 3 years before they really, have a chance to even make it, and then you build them up. And I don't see a lot of detriment from that perspective for a place like Iowa. And the good thing about it, Chad, is 85 is a hard number. We've seen it this year. They're at 87 right now, and they're going to have to. I'm sure somebody like Nick DeYoung and is probably getting an NIL scholarship for his 6th year. He's an in-state guy, and here you go. But now they can, hey, they've got a guy became available. In July, he'd already graduated. Maybe his coach left. Maybe he just, let's give this a shot. And then he comes to Iowa. He's a all MAC second-team wide receiver, and okay, we got a scholarship for you. Whereas before it's like we're all used up.
Well, thanks as always to our presenting sponsor of Legends and Listeners, GameDay Men's Health. Summer is not over, men, but it is closing down. So now's the time to go get yourself right, get back in the game with GameDay Men's Health. They can help with testosterone replacement therapy. Low T is very common, as you've heard us say over the past couple weeks. Every time I go into GameDay, it feels like there's more and more activity in there, Scott. More guys getting started. Love to see that. Hey, this is my first session. Hey, I got my first blood work coming up. People are realizing that GameDay Men's Health can help improve a lot of areas of your life, your mood, your muscle mass, your sex drive, your energy levels. Get your private, free, no obligation consultation today. Check them out at GameDayMen'sHealth.com or call their locations in Ankeny, West Des Moines, or where you live, North Liberty, Scott.
It's only a few blocks away from my house, so I walk over there. And some people like to get the shots in the mail, and that's cool. For me, it's like Monday morning, 8 a.m. Let's walk on over. It's only, quarter of a mile, half a mile away or whatever. So it's a good way to walk over there and start my week off right.
Yeah, I have always hated needles all my life, but now it's like second nature, and it's like I look forward to it almost. So yeah, it's it's kind of an interesting dynamic, but yeah, definitely feeling good, feeling great as this summer ends, and fired up to get into football season. Scott, what else on football? Like the enforcement thing, I thought was kind of interesting. I know that's for all sports, but it probably oversees football the most, or maybe men's basketball, I guess, as well, but. All third-party NIL deals valued at $600 or more must be approved by a newly created clearinghouse, almost like a arbitrator, essentially, like to determine whether NIL deals are legit. What do you make of kind of that, and how So if you do let me back up one sec. So if you do the math for like 105 football players, let's say they're getting. What I've heard as a starting number, maybe for Iowa, would be 8 to 9 million in football. It could go higher depending on the Title IX stuff. But that's about what was it? I had the math up just a second ago. Give me one sec. Divided by 105, about 80,000 per player is about what that could be. Now, if it goes to 15 million, you go ahead and almost double that. But 80,000, that's a lot of money, but it's not what a quarterback goes for. So how do you see all that playing out, especially with this arbitrator who can all of a sudden make guys ineligible if it's not a legit NIL deal? It seems a little bit, I always hesitate when the NCAA is tasked to enforce things.
Right. With this settlement, I wonder, what's going to happen next. Is there going to be a lawsuit? And this is one of the areas where I do question that somebody will say $600. You're going to question me over an autograph over $600 and deny it or something like that. Whereas, excuse me, that somebody wanted would pay $1,000 for it and you denied it. I could see some lawsuits working their way in. But I know from talking to a lot of the ADs in the past and even recently, they want to get the BS out of here, which is, hey, Illinois, you just paid, $500K for this basketball player, and all he has to do is go sign 3 basketballs, and here's your $500,000. And I'm using them as an example, but there's lots of teams like that, and the SEC and whatever, and they want to get that out of there, and that's why that there's going to be some sort of a clearinghouse. It's going to be a bureaucratic situation. We're going to hear horror stories and sob stories as always. Well, they won't let me do this. It happens all the time. But I think it's a good step. I think it's something that's important. And as far as Iowa goes, if it's $80K, I mean, we know that some players are going to make $1 million or close to it, and other players are going to make 20,000 and that's or less, because if you're the walk-on kid, you don't deserve the $80,000. You deserve $500, or whatever. And maybe the next year you deserve $80,000.
Yeah, I think I should have been clear about that. It's not like everybody has to get the same amount of money. I think one model I've read about, and I think would probably fit what Iowa does, would be like, a lower amount as a freshman, more as a sophomore, more as a junior. Maybe star players even have a more, a starter level player has a higher amount that they get of whatever this revenue sharing total is. But I can see something like that kind of, being they just don't want employment. Like, they desperately don't want employment. And so this is kind of their way around it, I guess. And so, I mean, that part makes sense to me for an Iowa, like, because I think they can sell enough guys on that model as opposed to like maybe the Ohio States and Alabamas of the world. Maybe that 5-star is going to cost them a lot out of the gate, and you probably don't necessarily fight that same battle at Iowa.
No,
That's
you're
kind of the
right.
way I'm thinking about it.
You're only going to need a couple of those to make it matter. I am concerned or curious, more than concerned, is, what does this do for collectives? Because collectives are still going to need to be there. Because you can't all have the same pool, and then somebody's going to want to sign at Tennessee the quarterback for $8 million, or like Nico, like they did, or even here you see that somebody, not Caden Proctor, but somebody like Caden Proctor wants to come here, and then you do the same thing. So there's going to be a need for that. But I think what this does, and I don't know what you feel, but I think there is some serious collective fatigue from fan bases that have just like, man, you're tapping me out. The school wants me to pay for, my seats. They want me to pay for my PSLs, my licenses, or contribute to the club and help us contribute in here. And then, oh, by the way, give me as much money as you can so we can go get these players. You're putting a lot on your fans, not just the big high money donors, but the fans. And so I don't know. I think that there could be a relief among fans that this is finally being taken over by the athletics departments. They're taking most of it. There still will be the need for a collective, but not the overall need, because it's expensive and fans can only do so much.
Yeah, I guess just closing the chapter on football for right now, I think kind of the vision I see maybe playing out would be like the Swarm Inc. type of things would continue, like to be obviously imperative, like the car dealership, with a deal for the starting quarterback, that type of thing. As opposed to, like you said, like, rattling the, going back to fans every year for, $20 a month or whatever to get a Swarm event or whatever. It's all been Brad Heinrich's, has been amazing, amazing effort for no salary to put all this together, to have an infrastructure there. But I think you're right. I think ideally that stuff doesn't have to continue, especially with this revenue sharing model. So I'm kind of looking at it more positively, potentially. I feel like it's got potential, but then you start going sport by sport, Scott, which we're going to do here, and you start to see, okay, well, that's going to be different. That's going to be different. Do you want to start with like the easy ones, like basketball, or you want to go right into like the baseballs and wrestlings of the world?
Basketball is easy, so we can avoid that as much as possible. Men's basketball now has 15 scholarships instead of 13, so it's even with women, but that's the number. The only question I have is, will either, and especially the women, still be allowed to have practice teams? They're male practice players that compete against the women, which is really helpful and necessary, because there's not a woman alive who could have guarded Caitlin Clark. But there's so sometimes having a man in there helps. But then also for the men, where you'd have, say, a roster like of gray teamers who are just simply practice teamers and don't have any hopes of playing. But I think there's some guys who played high school ball would be willing to do that. Can you have that? Because that kind of replaces it. But then again, Chad, there aren't a lot of players we're talking about. Men's basketball on a roster, even counting walk-ons, there's maybe a 16, right now, something like that. And then the financial breakdown, depending on when it happens, if it's marketability based, then that'll be, figured out. I'm sure both those sports at Iowa have got to be in that 2 through 4 range, depending on the year.
Yeah. I suspect that the men's practice team will continue for women's basketball. I did a big story on that this past season. I mean, they basically classify all those guys or 90% of them as managers. So it's kind of like a manager program. So I don't think that'll be a problem. And then you think about, I mean, I don't know if I've heard men's coaches say we don't really need 15 scholarships. I mean, there's only 5 spots. Iowa's at 12 right now for men. It's like they're fine. Like they're not missing anything. So maybe like a Trey Buchanan who they picked, the GM, Indiana Pacers GM's son. He walked on at Iowa. Maybe he picks up a scholarship, or maybe not. Maybe he's just one of the 15 on the roster, and they still fund 13 or whatever. So. And maybe it's a rotating thing. You know how the scholarships in basketball, come and go. Like maybe some years, Nicholas Bears will walk on, and maybe some years he's on scholarship. It's just depending on the numbers. I don't think it's that big of a deal. 13 versus 15 in men.
Right. There are years where you sign 4 freshmen in November, and then. You before you know it, you realize, what, we're really young in the post and we need to go get a player. And that's the year you have 14 scholarships. And then there are the years where we only sign 2 and then our guys are coming back and we only need 12. I could see it either way. I don't think it's that big of a deal. Women's basketball was at times has been really close in recent years, but no, that to me, this is the easy sport, and this is the one that will get figured out fairly quickly. The others, starting with, sport number, depending on your level 2A, B, or C, wrestling, and then the others, baseball and whatever, that's where things get tricky. And that's where Iowa is positioned in fantastic fashion and in really bad fashion. Probably those 2 sports, and to me in particular.
Let's start with wrestling because that could be – so it goes from 9.9, Scott, to 30. Now, it's the roster cap. These roster caps are the same as scholarships, so you can't have – they basically have that many wrestlers now for the most part. I mean, they have a ton of guys in there. Most of them are walk-ons. They can always – they're equivalencies, so they can divvy up those scholarships, as you know. It's not like – very few wrestlers are full ride. But that is one where it's like, I mean, there's no way you need to fund 30 scholarships, even if you're Iowa. like that's just not even sensible. Maybe it's your roster though still have it 30, but maybe it goes to maybe Iowa moves it to, let's say, 15 scholarships, and hey, if you're a starter, you get a full scholarship, and then the other, your top reserves, maybe they get 70% scholarship. You know what I mean? Something like that. I don't think you have to go to 30 there, but I just wonder in this arms race to spend, and I mean, you still got to spend. You still got to find the money for these guys. That's the other thing. If you increase, you number one got to offset it with women's scholarship, but you also have to actually spend the money on these scholarships. So that adds up, especially when you're already booking $22 million potentially for revenue sharing. So I just think that that's a sport that's going to be very vulnerable to cutting. I know it's not at Iowa, not saying that, but elsewhere where, does men's wrestling, sort of become the gymnastics type sport where there's just so few teams. What are there, like 6 teams in the Big Ten now in gymnastics? I mean, it's not many. Might not even be that many anymore. But does it become that? That's kind of where I see the wrestling thing going to me. I mean, maybe.
Yeah, I think you're right, and here's why, because in some of these programs that say we're going to go to 105 in football, They gotta find a way to cut or add scholarships, and it's going to be the easiest for them to cut. And then where do you start cutting? Well, sports that don't perform well financially, and Iowa performs very well. As we know, it's a very important sport to Iowa. But for Purdue or Michigan State or Illinois or Indiana, it's not even in the same stratosphere, or Northwestern. It's just not in that ballpark. And they can find a way very quickly to chop those scholarships by and adding them to football and be in good shape. I mean, it's not even a moneymaker for Iowa, but it's close enough and it matters. But at the other places, it doesn't. And so I think the funding part of it is for Iowa will be very interesting. I mean, from 9.9, do they go to 15? Do they go to 18? Do they go to 20? And they have to find the money, as you said, elsewhere. And maybe that goes, they decide we're going to do it equally between men's and women's. If we go to 16 for both, something like that, and then divide them up however you want. We're not going to go 30 unless somebody decides they want to write a check for 30 scholarships a year, which nobody's going to do. So I think that's probably going to be part of it.
Yeah, I think baseball is even more of a murky area to me, because though that's a sport where the ACC and the SEC teams, they're going to want to go as all in as they possibly can. That's not a sport that anyone down there is going to want to give up at all. Whereas I could even see in wrestling, let's say, I don't know, like a Michigan State, for example, like, hey, we gotta catch up to Michigan and Ohio State. Like, let's go 105 scholarships or whatever, 100 scholarships and cut wrestling. I mean, that's an easy, maybe not an easy decision, but that's a numbers decision you could do pretty quickly. Where it's not like Michigan State's winning a lot of, raising a lot of banners in wrestling. So, but in baseball, yeah, I mean, you go from, what was it, 11.7, right?
11.7 to 34.
Yeah, that's through roster cap, and they've always had right around there, like 30, 35-ish, I think. But you could have, you could divvy up the scholarships among like 27 guys. I feel for Rick Heller. Like that's probably the most insane amount of juggling and disadvantage of any sport at Iowa, because he's talked to me a lot in the past, and much of it on the record, just about how a lot of Southern programs, they have like other ways to put guys on scholarship through systems in their state. He calls it kind of funny money is what he calls it. Like, where it's like a guy isn't on your sports scholarship, but he gets like gets his education paid for through, let's say, the state of Mississippi or something, so they've already got like all these baseball players on scholarships. And that's, besides the weather, that's one of the reasons they're really good. But I don't know what Iowa will be, or other Big Ten schools or Northern schools is going to be willing to afford in baseball. I just don't know. I think the positive, kind of as I understand it, is like some of these SEC teams, ACC, they bring in 50, 70 guys and they'll make cuts, and leave guys hanging, but they can't do that anymore. 34 is the number. You can't go higher than that. And so maybe Iowa gets some benefit there potentially, but at the same time, I feel like Heller always just gets kind of the toughest end of the deal. I don't know how this is going to turn out for baseball. I really don't.
This is the toughest sport, I think, when it comes to Iowa to figure out. And what makes it difficult is Rick is such an outstanding coach. He's as good as a baseball coach as there is a coach in the building. Yeah.
He's made it work. He's like the Oakland A's in 2001. Yeah. I mean, it's like he figures out a way. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, whether it's him or it's Kirk or it's Lisa or now Jan, Tom Brands, he's in that stratosphere as being an outstanding coach, and he has made it work to where they've been competitive. And we know that before that, they were not competitive. 11.7 scholarships. has been a major disadvantage when he's gone against SEC teams, whether it's for talent or other things, because they can fill in the gaps with NIL. There are a lot of schools down there too that have like 16 sports, whereas Iowa's at 22, and the Big Ten as a whole is very broad based in their sports. There's really no wrestling in the SEC. There's no field hockey. There's just a lot of those sports that you see and around here. There's nothing there. But what this is going to cause every school to do is evaluate, kind of a Sophie's choice of what's important and what's not important when it comes to finances. And at Iowa, first of all, if you don't do everything you can to make football as competitive as possible, you're stupid. You have to make football competitive. And I would say that, wrestling, men's and women's basketball, you've got to put that in the same priority because the interest is so high. Just like at Nebraska, women's volleyball, at Minnesota, men's hockey. You've got to make sure that the ones that people care about are, that you feel like every year you should walk in and say, we have a chance to win the national title, that you do everything you can. But then when you look at a baseball team and how it's struggled financially, whereas in the SEC, baseball is as big or bigger than basketball is. And you're dealing with that. And then now they can offer up to 34 scholarships. And just think about how you can break the bank, in your scholarship bank. I mean, those are more extra scholarships than what you had for football if you want to use it fully funded. So, what's Rick going to get to play with? 15 maybe at most, but even then, that it's a sport that they struggle financially and so much that, you hate to say it, Chad, but you brought up Michigan State, and that's a really good example. If you're Michigan State and you're in Lansing, Michigan, and you decide we're going to put all our eggs in the football, men's basketball, ice hockey basket, and there's going to be collateral damage, and wrestling and baseball could be the two sports that you say, you know what, it's in the far north. We can't even get on our field until April at the earliest, and then we're not very good at it anyway. And wrestling, come on. We got Penn State, got Iowa, Ohio State in our league. We're lucky to get anybody there. We're just going to have to make do, so we can make sure we compete at those other sports. And yeah, I could see some collateral damage very quickly in the Big Ten.
Well, if you're an NCAA, if you're one of these athletics directors, you may want to reach for a bottle of Steeple Ridge bourbon to try to figure this thing out. Steeple Ridge delivers a high quality, delicious drinking, award-winning craft bourbon. If you don't find Steeple Ridge on your shelves at your local grocery store, ask for it by name. Steeple Ridge is distilled, aged, and bottled in Iowa by Lonely Oak Distillery. We thank them greatly for their support. And that leads me to Scott. What happens to the Olympic sports in the future? I don't, with the women's, the Title IX, that's not going away. There's zero chance Title IX is going away. Nope. So as I was listening to on one of the podcasts, the college podcast I listened to, it's like, yeah, you want to be a politician and bring that one up? Good luck. I want to repeal Title IX. It's just, number one is, they shouldn't be repealed. Number two, it'd just be a third rail type thing. So that's not going away. So what happens though to these, maybe the sports will exist, but maybe they are almost tiered. That's the word I keep hearing, tier 3 sports or whatever, like where in cross country, maybe you're giving one scholarship, maybe none, because why? I'm a cross country man. I was a cross country runner, so I'm not singling out that sport. I'm just saying, like, if you're whatever school, let's say, let's just say Iowa cross country, for example. Like, if you really need to travel to Oregon, you really need to travel to UCLA, like, and even like, let's say a women's soccer. Like, I'm not saying scholarship wise, but just, do you have to be traveling all around the country? Like, do you make these very low budget operations to be able to pay for this revenue sharing, to be able to pay for scholarships, to fully fund football, fully fund women's basketball, all those things? I just wonder, do you have any feel, I guess, Scott, for what's going to happen to those sports, the men's golfs, the other sports that Iowa doesn't even have, lacrosse. I mean, just
Lacrosse, yeah.
there's, I just wonder, like the Olympic sports movement, we're watching the Olympics right now. It's an interesting time because you're seeing like, hey, there's a reason the U.S. is good in a lot of sports is because like they have good college programs, in swimming, for example. Does that go away in the future, 15, 20 years from now? Do we not have that infrastructure? I don't know.
That's a really good question because you look at, again, the broad-based offerings. The Pac-12, specifically the California schools, have really supplied a lot of like the swimmers and some of these other sports. I don't see them all going away, but I could see, what I think needs to happen, frankly, is there needs to be a partnership in place between like the U.S. Olympic Committee and training complex and the colleges to continue to fund these sports, men's gymnastics, specifically the men's, because the men's are the ones that are getting chopped. I mean, men's gymnastics got chopped here a few years ago. Men's tennis is probably one that I could see getting probably a little more cuts, out of it. Golf pays off a little bit because there's always courses around here. But if you're like men's tennis, I know I would go to Europe or something to get players. And you're like, well, why are you doing that? And I think there's some questions as to what's going to happen in the future there, those sports. But, kind of like the baseballs and the wrestlings, and, it's really more about revenue versus non-revenue sports. And, also I think the leagues, now that we've been in an expansion era and a realignment era, the leagues have to take some responsibility in how they schedule. And part of that is,
right,
limit the number of trips. They did a nice job in volleyball this year. I will say that. Then looking at volleyball, everybody had to play everybody, but they made sure that they doubled up on these trips, that whether they were coming east or teams out here were going west, that you've got 2 stops in one trip type of thing. And they got to continue to do that because, as you said, like women's soccer, I mean, they're going to play the schedule that they're given, at least the league schedule, but it's up to the league to say, is it really important to play X number of games at X number of sites instead of, well, we should make sure Iowa and UCLA play every other year. Well, is it really that important? Maybe you have a weekend where you play in the middle sometime. I don't know. I'm just spitballing, but I do think that's something to discuss to save money. But ultimately, when you're talking about scholarships, it has to even out. And so if you add 10 more in football, 5 more in men's wrestling, 5 more in baseball, that's 20 more. You have to add the other side, or more than 20, depending on your percentage. And that could be, softball could benefit from that. And it should. Right. Iowa softball needs to be better, period. That's a sport to me that is really in the last 15 or so, since Gail Blevins left, has fallen, and it should never fall that far down. What do you do with volleyball? That goes from 12 to 18 scholarships. In a place like Nebraska, they're going to fully fund it. Iowa probably should too, but then that would be 18 more scholarships than they had Big Ten wins last year.
A mic drop. Yeah, I think, I guess as I listen to this and think about it and look at the numbers, like I feel like the least painful way for a Beth Getz to approach this is to make the increases on the men's side scholarship wise, because you got to have the roster spots anyway for baseball, for wrestling, football. Like those are, like, let's say, like you said, let's say you add, I don't know, 25 scholarships among those 3 sports. I don't know, that's a fair number, maybe 30. Yeah. Softball goes to 25 roster cap. Like, could you add 8 softball, and could you add 8 track and field? I mean, you move up pretty quick on the women's side. On the women's side, you're going to move up, that gives you flexibility. That's
Field
the
hockey.
flexibility you need. Because it used to be, field hockey. Like they used to be 12, right? 12.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's 27. So, you can definitely offset those men's scholarships pretty easily, but because of the increase there.
Mm-hmm.
So you may not have to cut sports, but I think that's probably the least painful way as we kind of talk it through, as long as she can find the money. And I think a school like Iowa with the Big Ten revenues, what is it going to be next year? You had the tweet last week,
75 million compared to 61.8 or whatever. So I mean, you're talking about a jump from $14 million from Big Ten revenues. And I'm not going to criticize athletics departments, Iowa among them, for having bloated payrolls, but now you're going to have to start looking. Do you really need that fifth person to take video of the women's basketball team in their little circle in Cleveland, versus maybe using that for some of your players? That's what you're going to have to look at. I mean, there's no need to have 3 photographers and 5 videographers to make sure you have the perfect picture of the circle, and when they're all getting in together, that you can avoid some of that. And I think that's probably some of it that's going to have to trim down. Do you need X number of this, Y number of that? And they're going to have to, it's not COVID where they had to really chop and take furloughs and stuff, but they're going to have to really consider some of those options.
Yeah, I just did some quick math. Let's say you added 60 scholarships if you're the University of Iowa, 30 men, 30 women to kind of offset everything. That's $2.4 million if you have a budget $40,000 per athlete. I don't know. Maybe that's high. Maybe that's low. Could check with Greg Davies or Beth Getz on if that's a good estimate. But $2.4 million, that's not that much in the grand scheme of things. So I feel like Beth did say last week in Indy, like, we're not looking at cutting sports, and she knew what we were talking about. We knew the revenue sharing model. So I don't see Iowa cutting sports. But yeah, just what do they do with the scholarships? That's going to be fascinating. And a school like Iowa State, I know Jamie Pollard's been open. Like, that's going to be tougher for them. They don't have the $75 million coming in. Like 2.4 million. That's a lot. That's a big swing for that size of athletics department budget. So it's going to be different everywhere. It seems to me that Beth Getz is willing to fund as much as she can, I guess, at this point.
If you're looking at some of the schools like let's say Iowa State and Penn State, and you're saying, what, specifically to Iowa State, we're going to do whatever it takes in football, and that's going to be it. But we got to offset that on the women's side. Maybe you add women's wrestling. You have the infrastructure in place. You find a way to make it work. Maybe it's that could help you out, and there is a budding market for that. In places where wrestling is important. And so to me, that could be the ultimate beneficiary is women's wrestling out of this whole thing. But, for other things, I mean, Iowa might be able to add 5, 6, 8, 10 scholarships in wrestling, and maybe Iowa State can't because of that. And does it help you? Yeah, sure it does in recruiting. But, at the same time, you've just got to double down on what makes you good and successful. And, ultimately it's going to be a different puzzle and mosaic than we've ever seen before, because teams and schools are going to have to double down on what they do well and then just survive, figure you don't want to say you're not important, but there is a pecking order. And at Iowa, wrestling is the top of the list when it comes to Olympic sports. And maybe on the women's side, it's like, we're going to lean really hard on field hockey because we're good at it. Maybe in women's tennis, just go out there and try your best. We're happy for you, and then same thing with volleyball, but then softball, like, we've underachieved for the last 20 years. Let's do something about it.
Sure.
And those are the things that they really need to do. And I don't see them taking a back seat in track either, for that matter. I think with Joey Woody that they've got something good going there. I mean, they got an Olympian running, Brittany Brown,
right.
That's pretty awesome.
Right. Well, anything else you want to, we're about an hour here, Scott, anything we left out on the revenue sharing? I think it was really important we dive into it, especially from the Hawkeye perspective.
No, I think we've hit. We could stop right now, or we could continue for another hour, Chad. But
Yeah,
I
right.
think let's stop right now.
Perfect. Scott and I will be back with you next week on Legends and Listeners. More football-centered episode, but thank you for joining us. For Scott Dochterman, I'm Chad Leistikow. Talk to you soon on Legends and Listeners, as always, from the Channel Seed Studios and only on the Iowa Everywhere Network.